The following video is the Union City, Tennessee Rotary Club's November 9th, 2012 meeting. Speaking that day is the club's own World War II veteran, Lieutenant Colonel William W. Tanner.
When I asked the speaker today for a Veterans Day address, quite frankly, he was a bit reluctant. He was concerned that his presentation might not be as eloquent as he would want it to be. I said, that's okay. They've had me for 5 years, or 5 months now. They're used to the lack of eloquence. He said that he might even lose a word in a sentence. I told him that's okay. I said, see these guys to my far left, they lose their name from time to time. That's okay. Sorry. No, seriously today, I don't think anyone in this room will ever lose their admiration for our speaker today. Amen. As a fellow Rotarian, as a leader in our community, and most especially today as a veteran of World War II. It is an extreme honor and privilege to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Bill Tanner.
Somebody coming in, you never appreciate being young till you get old. And this is I think this is about the 6th time that I've spoken to Rotary over the years, and undoubtedly it'll be the last time. I've always had a problem with how to squeeze 3 years and 8 campaigns into a 30-minute talk. There's just no way to do it. But today I think I have a partial solution. My mother saved every letter that I wrote home during World War II. And recently, my wife rounded them all up and published them in a book. In a little book. And at the conclusion of the program, there'll be a stack of those books with a door and one right here somewhere. And you're welcome to take one of those books. Now, it costs about $10 a piece to publish them, so there's a little basket beside them, and if you want to put a little money in the basket to help defray the cost of printing, that's all right. But if you don't have the money, take the book anyway. But they'll be available to people that are outside the Rotary Club from Lancers for $10. My military career got off to a pretty rocky start. It started off with a court martial. And I'll tell you how that happened. As World War II approached, the War Department activated Company K of the 117th Infantry, Tennessee National Guard, right here in Union City. All the members of the company were local people, and Tom Elam was the company commander. I was home from Knoxville where I was in school. I was in ROTC up there, so Tom made me a sergeant in the company, at least for the summer. And they had orders right away for the company to go to South Mississippi, to the DeSoto National Forest for maneuvers. So we started, but the governor stopped us in Jackson. The next day was election day, and Gordon Browning from over at Huntington was running for re-election. And he was afraid that Ed Crump, who at that time was the political boss of Shelby County, he was afraid he would steal the election. So he stopped the National Guard in Jackson, so if it was necessary, we could patrol the polls in Memphis the next day. But it wasn't necessary. So we resumed the trip to the DeSoto National Forest. And we were on I guess the raddest old train the railroad had. Of course, air conditioning in those days was just a dream. And a lot of the windows wouldn't let down. And after sleeping on the hardwood floor in that Jackson Armor there, everybody was kind of sleepy. So nearly all the men were asleep in the train there, either on the seats or under the seats or wherever they could. I was in charge of one car. And Robert Harrison, who was later sheriff of the county here, was asleep under one of the seats, and his feet were sticking out in the aisle. Weissel Hartwell was the supply sergeant for the company. So Weissel came through and said, Sergeant Tanner said, have that man get his feet out of the aisle. I said, well, Weissel is not bothering anything. Nobody's going up and down. I don't want to wake him up. He said, I said get his feet out of the aisle. That's an order. And I said, well, I ain't going to do it. He said, well, how would you like for me to report you to Captain Elam? And I said, how would you like to kiss my ass? He reported me to Captain Elam. Well, they convened a summary court-martial and tried me and found me guilty. But that was the end of it. I went on back to Knoxville, ROTC there. And one of the best instructors in ROTC I believe I ever had, Major Hyde, was a veteran of World War I. And he knew what he was talking about. He taught us a lot of things that were of value later on. He taught us how to use machine guns in pairs and found defensive fires, and how to issue orders, not so they could be understood, but so they couldn't be misunderstood. And he gave us an example of how not to issue an order. He said, the captain said to his men, now men, we'll hold this hill as long as possible and then retreat. And I'm a little lame, I'm starting now. But the most important thing that he told me, he was talking about security. He says it's pardonable to be defeated, but it's unpardonable to be surprised. He wanted you to teach you to keep your patrols out and so forth. Pardonable to be defeated, and I never forgot that. And I thought about it every time I'd read in the paper where the Americans were ambushed in Vietnam or Iraq or somewhere else. I said, I wish they'd had Major Hyde. That wouldn't have happened. Anyway, World War II came on, and the Atlantic Ocean was just alive with German submarines. They had sunk Allied shipping all up and down the Atlantic coast, dozens of ships. The Navy had corralled every ship they could find in Chesapeake Bay. Had over 800 ships available there to go for an invasion. Well, they had some of them were good ships, and some of them were just old clunkers. And I remember the last time I was talking about that, Charlie Vaughan spoke up and said, I was on one of those old clunkers. But we left Chesapeake Bay, left Norfolk in October 42. We didn't know where we were going until we got out to sea, but we were going to Africa. Now, it took 21 days to make the crossing, and I've often thought what a miracle it was, and how the Navy did it, I don't know, to take 800 ships of all sorts and take them over 21 days from Norfolk to Africa without losing a ship. Now, that was, to me, that was a miracle, but their destroyers would run around the edge, didn't have radar in those days, and they would ping for the submarines and drop a depth charge occasionally, which looked like an oil barrel full of explosive. And if they hit one of them, of course, you'd get an oil slick on top of the water. But anyway, we made it all the way without losing a ship. We landed 70 years ago yesterday. We landed at Safi, in what was then French Morocco, on the west coast of Africa. And Our first opponent was the French Foreign Legion. We fought the Foreign Legion, but it was a short battle. It lasted not much more than a day, and was all over. So then we marched 238 miles through Mazagan and Mogador up to Casablanca, and stopped there temporarily to hold a parade for President Roosevelt, who had met Churchill there in Casablanca. Then on to Port Leone, from Port Leone then across Algeria over the Atlas Mountains to Tunisia. And we went down to the southern part of Tunisia. Now Tunisia has a mountain range that runs right north and south, right down the middle of Tunisia. And there are three main passes through the mountains. The Kazrin Pass, Faid Pass, and the southernmost pass is the pass at El Guitar. Well, about that time, General Montgomery in the British 8th Army had finally stopped Rommel and the African Corps at El Alamein in Egypt. He had just run rings around the British for 2 or 3 years there in Libya and in North Africa. But the United States sent so many guns and tanks and trucks and everything to him there in Libya. Montgomery was a very cautious commander. He didn't move till he had a big advantage. But he had a big advantage there, and Rommel had extended his supply line so far clear across Libya that he was having trouble getting enough gasoline for his tanks. Anyway, he had to pull back, and the 8th Army chased him all the way back to southern Tunisia, where they set up a defense line, an old French line called the Mareth Line, which was anchored on one end by the Mediterranean Sea, and on the other end was an impassable salt marsh. So it was a natural defensive place. It would have been very difficult for the British Army to penetrate. So the mission of the 9th Division was to attack from the west and take a little pressure, take part of the strength off of that Mareth line so that perhaps Montgomery and his 8th Army could penetrate. Well, we'd had just a little experience in combat there when we first landed there with the Foreign Legion, but that was all. So we were relatively a green division. Now, there's no division that's any good at all until it gets shot up. That sounds funny to say that, but that's true. You get rid of the weak sisters and find out who can do the job and who can't and so forth. So we were a relatively new green division. And we had come up against, or would come up against, the Africa Corps, which was the elite of the German army. They were perhaps one of the finest military units ever assembled. They had superior weapons. They had, their tanks were superior, their guns were superior, they had smokeless powder. They were better trained, and they were highly motivated. And so it really wasn't a very even match. So we only had, the 9th Division only had 2 of its regiments, the 47th and the 39th, because the 60th Infantry was about 30 or 40 miles away at McNasty with the 1st Division fighting there. So we just had 2 regiments, that is 6 battalions. And we started that attack. And as you stood if you stood at El Guitar, which was just a little oasis in the desert down there, and the blacktop road ran from Gafsa to Gabis on the Mediterranean Sea right through the pass there at El Guitar. And right on one side of the road there was Hill 291, which was a heavily fortified hill. And from that hill, El Hammer Ridge extended on to the right. And you stood at the little oasis there in El Guitar and looked east down that road. You'd look across about, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 miles, flat ground, just flat as this floor. And then you came to 2 or 3 ridges. And behind the ridges were some mountains, some of them rising as high as 20,000 feet above the desert floor. Now the Germans had all the high ground and had observation over everything. Well, as we launched the attack, they told us that the resistance would be very light. We didn't have anything to worry about. Well, how little did they know. When we got there, instead of being light resistance, we ran into a real buzzsaw. And the first thing that happened was the lead company of the 2nd Battalion, which was Company E, with Colonel Gershonow, the battalion commander at the head of the company, along with his staff and 2 or 3 other company officers. They walked right into a German ambush. Apparently he hadn't been through Major Hyde's class. They walked right into this ambush and they were receiving machine gun fire from three sides. And in the first, not more than an hour, all of Company E and the battalion commander and his staff and several other company commanders that were up there, they were all either killed or captured. Well, that's a pretty rough way to start. Everything seemed to go wrong from then on. The casualties were heavy. I don't know how many platoon leaders and company commanders we lost, but a whole lot. And of the 6th Battalion, we lost 5 of the battalion commanders. I never heard of something like that happening before. 5 out of the 6th Battalion we lost there. Well, it went on for 11 days. And toward the end of that time, the Germans had begun to draw back because the British Army was putting a lot of pressure on from the Maras line coming up. And they began to draw back and forming some more defensive positions there in Tunisia. And we finally took our objective, Hill 291. The only reason we could take it really was because they were drawing back and had vacated some of the positions on top of the hill there. Well, as soon as we took it, we swarmed over it. It was heavily fortified, a lot of gun positions and pits and things there. And way back at the regimental headquarters, which was 5 or 6 miles back, and the Germans, you couldn't cross it in the daytime because it was all under observation. And back at regimental headquarters, they would look through the field glasses and saw all these people on Hill 291. And they thought they were Germans. So they brought all the artillery they could get, all the division artillery and the corps artillery, and they put one hell of a barrage on 291. I mean, it shook the earth. Well, of course, we all jumped over in these German positions. You can pretty well survive a barrage if you're below ground level in one of those holes, unless the shells hit right on top of you, of course. So we all, well, as soon as that barrage lifted, you could hear somebody over yelling, "Medic, medic, medic." You knew different ones had been hurt. And you know, I just have to pause to say that really, I think the unsung heroes of the war were the company aid men. When anybody got hurt, it was probably in an exposed position. And as soon as he got hurt, he wanted a medic, and the medics went right there to him. We lost a lot of medics doing that, but they did. They went right there to him. They were unarmed, carrying their first aid kits and so forth. But anyway, it really shook the earth. Now, before this ever started, Colonel Randall, our regimental commander, he was one of the very best. He was no World War I veteran. And back then, they were talking about combat exhaustion. I think now they call it traumatic stress or something. But it was combat exhaustion back then. And Colonel Randall said, "There'll be no combat exhaustion in the 47th Infantry." And you know, there wasn't. I was more afraid of him than I was of the Germans. There was no combat exhaustion there except for one case. Now, my company commander had been killed, and I had taken command of our company. The company commander of L Company had been killed, and my best friend, one of my best friends, Jim Cobb, from Louisiana, I think he edited the yearbook down at LSU. He'd taken command of L Company, and we jumped in the same hole. And I mean, it was pretty nerve-wracking. But after the barrage lifted, he waited until dark and made his way all the way back to the regiment and asked to be relieved of command. Colonel Randall said, "Lieutenant," said, "I'm going to give you 3 choices. You can go back up there and lead those men, or I'll court-martial you and give you a dishonorable discharge, or you can take your pistol and blow your brains out. Now, I don't care what you do. Well, actually, he didn't do any of it. Somehow that he managed to get some kind of a job in the rear area there. Well, we left El Gatar, which was in the desert country there, and moved across the rear of the British First Army to the northern part of Tunisia. It's a different country altogether up there. The hills are covered by brush and little dwarf, the trees are stunted, they're not very big. They're right there off the Mediterranean, of course. And then there's some big, great, big, wide open hills there. And two of those hills were right astride the road into Missouri. That was our purpose in going up there, was close out the Tunisian campaign, capturing Missouri and Tunis. On one side of the road was Green Hill, and the other side was Bald Hill. Well, it was so far from from our lines to the German lines that you could hardly send a patrol. You could hardly send a patrol at night and have them come back. We had to use what they call layout patrols, which send a patrol out at night, and they would hide in a cactus patch or a thicket or something and observe, and then come back at night. But the worst kind of patrol, you'd get a call from the regiment. Our headquarters was so anxious to know exactly where the Germans were, where their position was, and so forth. And they said, send out a patrol and keep going till you draw fire. Well, that's a pretty rough thing to keep going. When you draw fire, you're in trouble. And so it's a pretty tricky thing to get close enough to draw fire and not get hit. But so I always dreaded those patrols where you go till you draw fire. Anyway, we were occupying a little brush-covered, we called it a nose, it stuck out there. And they had me to take 2 platoons of the company and move further out as a base for deep patrolling. Well, I had ordered from the replacement center, you couldn't order anybody by name, but we needed 1 platoon leader, a 2nd lieutenant. So I'd ordered that, and he was coming up to join the company. And he was coming up through an old sunken road. His name was John B. Wiley. He lived on Bethlehem Road right out of Clarksville, Tennessee. Later worked for the highway department. But he was coming up this road, and he spotted a German patrol coming. Well, luckily, he saw the patrol before they saw him. So he just ducked to the side and laid down in the brush, waiting for them to pass by. But the problem was they didn't pass by. They got up to where he was and stopped for the night. He had to lay there all night without making a sound or movement or anything. Next morning early, they moved out and he came on in. Well, we finally ended that up in Tunisia there. We finally rounded up all the Africa Corps on Cape Bon there between Tunis and Missouri. I think that we took maybe 25 or 30,000 prisoners there all at once. Of course, Rommel had already flown back to Germany. So we left there then and went to Sidi Bel Abbes, which is just south of Oran in Algeria, to prepare to invade Sicily. Well, this was August, and it was hot, and somehow the War Department gave all of our khaki clothes to the French, and we were still in wool ODs. And the temperature must have been, I don't know how much over 100, but it was, and the flies were fierce down there. But anyway, we got ready to go to Sicily, and we invaded Sicily in August of 1943. Now, the Sicilian campaign was a fairly short campaign because the Germans had already decided that Sicily was almost indefensible. And they had started this withdrawal to set up defensive positions in Italy, across the just little narrow straits of Messina there that separates Sicily from Italy. So we were moving up there, And that was the first place, really the only time in the war that I remember ever coming into contact with naval warfare. I think in German it means smoke thrower, but what it was, that was the forerunner of all these missiles that you see on the Army flying, you see on television shooting these missiles. Well, I think the naval warfare was probably the forerunner for that. It would be about, I don't know, 6, 8 big tubes, maybe 120 millimeters or greater, mounted on a chassis. They'd fire them one at a time. And when they might be a mile or 2 miles away, but when they'd fire one, it made a very characteristic roaring sound. You go, rum, rum, rum. You knew they were coming. You didn't know where, but you knew they were on their way. If they went beyond you, you'd hear them as they went overhead. But if they were coming in your neighborhood right there, close to you there, you wouldn't hear them until they hit. And when they hit, I mean, they shook the earth and put out a thing of shrapnel in all directions. In fact, I think I've got one little tiny piece that they failed to get when they picked it out of my rear end and hit it. They missed one little piece, but it never had bothered me, so I haven't worried about it. But anyway, that was the first thing I remember about this is those naval warfare. Now we were moving up, there's some big hills in Sicily. I mean big hills, big bare hills. And as you go up those hills, you look up there and you think you see the summit, you think it's the top. But when you get there, there's another summit clear on higher. It was terribly hot in August, and we were moving up in a column of twos there. And we only had one little old canteen of water for all day, and everybody was just dying for a drink of water. But they'd called and told us that don't drink out of any of the wells. The Germans had poisoned all the wells in that area, so don't drink out of the wells. Well, we moved by, we passed several wells, and I was at the head counter. Somebody said, look out, said somebody went over to the well. I looked back at one man had run over to the well, drawn a bucket of water, had his canteen cup out to drink it. It just flew all over me. And I ran back as far as I could, and I hit his canteen cup with the butt of my carbine, knocked it about 20 feet in the air. And I wasn't too proud of what I said, but I said, son, I'll kill you just like I would a snake. And of course, I really didn't mean I wouldn't have killed him. I wasn't sure. At any rate, nobody else tried to drink any water until we got past that area there. Well, we finished the campaign there in Sicily and moved to England. We got to England just before Christmas and took a little English train across England down to Basingstoke, which was just west of London, about, 30, 40 miles west of London. And we were there, we were training and getting ready for the invasion of Europe. And of course, in June, the invasion came. Now, the Allies only had 2 divisions in England that had any combat experience, the 1st and the 9th. All the rest of them were green divisions. And just like I was telling you a while ago, a green division ain't worth a toot till it gets shot up. So the plan was to make the landing with these new divisions, because it don't make a bit of difference whether you experienced it or not if you're in a little boat bobbing around in the water out there. So they made the landing with the green division, and they held the 1st and 9th division to exploit whoever was lucky enough to get ashore. So we landed on the 10th of June, D+4. We landed behind the 4th and 9th divisions. Now, they had gotten ashore there on the beach, but they hadn't gone very far. Oh, I'd say at the most, maybe a half mile or more from the beach, you could still hear small arms fire from the beach. They bogged down, couldn't move, taking heavy casualties. So we landed and passed through them, and we went right on through there. We went straight across the Cherbourg Peninsula, cut it off, came out at Barneville over on the other side, and sealed off the Cherbourg Peninsula. Now, the Allies were desperate to capture Cherbourg because they needed a deep water port. You can't unload tanks and trucks on the beach very well. They needed a port with the equipment and all to unload those heavy things. So we captured Cherbourg. And then we, after capturing Cherbourg, we came down and started to, well, first we had to neutralize the Cap de la Hague. It's a peninsula that just goes out from Cherbourg, extends out in the Atlantic Ocean. And it was heavily fortified with concrete pillboxes and all sorts of stuff. We cleaned that up and then had to break out of the peninsula. And what we ran into then was what they call the bocage country or hedgerows. There were little fields about maybe 5 or 6 acres, small fields, that they'd cultivated for centuries. And where all the borders of them, a mound of dirt had gradually grown up there with trees and bushes and sometimes some wire in there. And it was ideal for defense. The Germans could put their machine guns in there with their smokeless powder, and you couldn't pick them up at all. If we fired one of our machine guns, an old World War I 30 caliber water-cooled machine gun, you fire it, it looked like you started a bonfire, the smoke all going up. It's easy to be picked up. But it was tough going. And we finally solved the problem a little bit. We put bulldozer blades on the front of the tanks to punch holes in these fence rows. And that helped some. But it was rough going, and we took a good many casualties. And on one occasion, the little town of Saint Jean de Day, we had pushed ahead a little faster than the unit on our left or on our right, and left a kind of a gap in there. The Germans exploited that and attacked and overran our command post real quick. I had just returned to the command post and was taking off my boots, and all of a sudden this firing broke out all around there, and I didn't even take time to tie my boots. I got out of there, and just barely in time. They took the command post, took several prisoners and everything we had there. But it didn't last long because the units on each side closed in there, and we recaptured them, everything. So we moved on then, and in July, I guess it was the 25th of July, we had gotten up to the St. Lô-Perriers Road. It's a blacktop road, and along that road was the Germans had found a really strong defensive position. They called it Operation Cobra, and the plan was to saturate with bombing up and down the road there, and then break through a hole there so that the armor could go through and spread out. We were one of the lead battalions, and just before the bombing started, about 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, we had withdrawn 1,200 yards for safety's sake. Just pulled back 1,200 yards, and the blacktop road was the safety line. And the dive bombers came first. They bombed up and down the road there, and then the medium bombers came. I forget how many, I think 800 or something medium bombers saturated. And then the heavy bombers, the Flying Fortresses and the Liberators, and those heavy bombers came. They were all dropping 500-pound personnel bombs, is what they were dropping. And if I'm not mistaken, there were close to 1,800 planes. But you can't imagine the din and the noise that all those bombs kicking up dirt and dust and going off from the plane engines. It was something else. And then the worst thing that could happen happened. That blacktop road was the safety line, of course. Well, there was so much dust and smoke and stuff in the air that the road became invisible. And the wind shifted and started blowing back over us. So that all those planes, they couldn't see the safety lines, couldn't see anything down there but all this dust and smoke. They said, well, that must be the spot right there. and they turned their bombs loose right on us. And the lead battalion suffered over 600 casualties from our own planes there. And in our command group, there were 2 of us that survived. Colonel Clement and I survived. It knocked my canteen off my belt and just tore the stock out of his carbine, and a big 500-pound bomb hit right beside us but didn't go off. So we were the only 2 out of the command group that survived. But we lost so many people there that they passed. But see, behind us, they had been accumulating troops for a long time for this breakthrough. So they passed another battalion through us. So the breakout was successful. We broke through, and the tanks got out and spread out and so forth. And then the Germans went sort of I guess you'd say sort of a general retreat over everywhere. And the plan was to form several little combat commands to pursue the Germans as they retreated. In the book it says you're supposed to conduct a pursuit to the utmost limit of human endurance, and that's what we did. So my battalion was attached to the 3rd Armored Division. Our battalion rode on a battalion of tanks in the 3rd Armored Division. And about 3 or 4 of these little combat commands that would operate far out ahead of the main body to keep pressure on the Germans. And we would ride on the tanks, and the Germans, of course, were putting up any way they could to delay us, leaving behind this, that, and other thing. And we'd go till we hit resistance, and then the men would climb off the tanks and go down and clean out the resistance. We'd get back on the tanks, and here we'd go again. We went clear across France in about, a little over a week, I think it was. And as we went, we liberated these towns all along the way. Oh, you can't imagine what it's like liberating one town after another, dozens of them. And of course, when you liberate a town, they didn't know we was anywhere close. But when they'd see us, the town, when we'd pull up to a town there, well, it would be deserted, it looked like, all the windows, blinds closed, nobody out. But as soon as they saw us, the whole town would just erupt into the streets. And they came out and climbed all over our vehicles and us, bringing wine and roses and anything they'd say from the Germans, hugging us and kissing us. You can't imagine that. But the depth of the feeling there was unbelievable. There were several women in each one of these towns. There'd be some women who had lived with the German officers while they were occupying them. They'd bring those women out, they'd strip them, hang them up on a pole. They had one poor woman, they had a rope on them, wanted to tie it to the bumper of my Jeep and let me drag it down the road. And the women would just, there'd be a crowd around them, and the women trying to get to them and reach over the crowd to get a lick out of them. And it was just the most intense feelings I believe I've imagined anybody having, and I can understand why. Well, we went clear across France there to Belgium. We got a little bit better welcome in Belgium there, and then right through Belgium, and we had moved so fast that we beat most of the Germans back to the Siegfried Line. Now, after World War I, the French constructed the Maginot Line to prevent any future invasion from Germany. Of course, the Germans just went around it through Belgium. But they had this Maginot Line, and the Germans constructed the Siegfried Line, roughly parallel to it, against the French. It was very intricate with all the concrete and the tank barriers and everything. But we got there so fast that we went through the Siegfried Line before they ever got it fully manned. We had very little opposition in going through the Siegfried Line. We went through it and immediately went into the Hürtgen Forest. And the Germans lost complete track of us. They didn't know where we were. And we had an objective of a little town of Chevenhout, which was about, I guess about maybe 20 miles, maybe not that far, maybe 15 miles east of Aachen. Aachen was an old Roman city right on the border between Belgium and Germany. And the 2 divisions had been trying to take Aachen for a month or more. And it was a tough thing trying to take it. We were right 50 to 20 miles into Germany, right in the middle of the Germans' rear area on a very important road junction. It was quite a thorn in their sides. And they tried several times to knock us off without any success. And finally one morning, they decided they were going to get us one way or another. So they had a couple of diversionary attacks about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock from the north to turn our attention that way. And then about a half hour later, the main attack came from the east, 48th German Regiment, and they put down the heaviest barrage I believe I've ever experienced. They began at one end. Now, Chevenhout was just one main street surrounded by woods. And at one end of it was a little hotel and a few buildings and a church at the other end, and so forth. And they began at one end, this barrage, and rolled through to the other end. They knocked out all our lines, telephone lines, and most of the radios, and completely overran our position. I called regiment to tell them that we were completely overrun so they could make arrangements about it, but we never moved. Everybody stayed right in their positions. We had a Sergeant Gazan with the 746 Tank Battalion was attached to the battalion, and he was running up and down that street in his tank, shooting Germans just like he was hunting rabbits or something. And the same with Sergeant Thorndike with his tank destroyers. And everybody got into the battle, the cooks, and we had an attached platoon of chemical mortars, all because they were all over us from every side there. But when it was all over, I think they hauled out the next day 153 German bodies from right in the middle of our position. I think we lost about 13 killed and 38 wounded. And I don't know how many they lost in the woods right around there from mortar and artillery fire. But they never tried us again. We sat right there on that junction in Chevenhout there. And that pretty well sealed it. Well, after that, we were there till about Christmas. And then you remember just before Christmas, the regimental commander decided to send the 3 battalion commanders back to Verviers, or Yukon, one of the two, I forget which, for the weekend. We hadn't had a break since June, and this was just before Christmas. So we went back there, and as we went back early that morning, the other 2 battalion commanders, Allgood and Malis, left that morning going back. But I had scheduled a training exercise that afternoon, so I didn't leave till almost dark. And I told my Jeep driver as we drove back to comment on the unusual amount of German air activity. We didn't know it till we got back, but they were dropping parachutes on every crossroad just after we crossed. But we made it back to Yukon there, and the next morning we looked out and everybody in the rear area had a gun. That was pretty unusual. Then we heard about the Germans making this penetration. We couldn't hardly believe it. We had to head back fast as we could to our outfits. Well, what had happened was, our position was near Monschau, and south of us, in a sort of a quiet sector of the line, were 2 or 3 brand new divisions that never had any combat experience. And when the German von Rundstedt hit them with the tanks and infantry and everything, he went through them like a dose of sauce. They became completely I can't think of the word I want, but anyway, they really just were running and just panic-stricken. And our regimental commander, Colonel George Smythe, who, by the way, was a halfback on Walter Camp's first All-American team. But he took so many of those units that were running back and incorporated them into our defense that they started calling the 47th Regiment the 47th Division. We had so many. But anyway, we were sitting right astride the ridge that leads from Elsenborn to Antwerp. Now the real objective of the Bulge was Antwerp, because that was one of the main ports where the Americans were getting supplies through. And they wanted to get to Verviers or Eupen there in Belgium to replenish the supplies they had to continue there. But the weather was in their favor because the air couldn't fly much. It was just, the weather was so bad. But that was a case of where those new divisions had never been shot up, and it just ran through like melted butter. Well, the boats finally wound up, and then the next job was getting to the Royal River, which was pretty rough going to get there. And when we got there, we couldn't cross the Royal River, of course, because well, I've already run out of time. And so I guess I ought to stop right there and give you a chance to ask any questions that you want to ask.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Go ahead.
Well,
Keep going. Keep going.
well, we couldn't cross the Royal River because at the headwaters of the Royal, the Germans controlled 5 big dams, kind of like our TVA dams. And had they crossed the Royal River, the Germans could have turned loose all that water and flooded the whole Royal Valley, and the crossing would have been a disaster. So had to get hold of those dams, had to occupy the dams before we could ever think about crossing the Royal River. And that was a tough job. They'd tried every way in the world to get them. Well, finally they sent us up there to get them, and we finally took those towns there, crossed the Royal River. The next job then was going to the Rhine, and that was another job, getting to the Rhine. My objective was some high ground on the Rhine overlooking Bonn. And we walked at night in a column of twos right through the German army. We went so close to the artillery we could hear them giving orders and smell the bacon frying. But we walked right on through there and came out on that on a bluff overlooking the Rhine River. We'd hardly gotten there till we got word that the Ludendorff Bridge had been captured. The 9th Armored Division, not the Infantry Division, but the 9th Armored Division had captured this bridge intact. Now, it was set for demolition, but the demolitions exploded, but they didn't take the bridge down. It was still standing. So they got across it and just had a little patch of ground at the end of the bridge. That was all. And so they called, just like during the war, the 2 workhorse divisions, the 1st and the 9th, were the 2 that landed in Africa. They were the American 2nd Corps in Africa under General Patton, but they fought together throughout the war, and they were really the workhorse divisions. So I got word to immediately proceed to Remagen. Now, the other 2 battalions of our regiment were a lot closer to the bridge than I was. I was about 20 miles downstream from it. And I had cut off my radios that night when we went through because they squawk and make so much racket. And we cut them off, and that just drives the higher headquarters. It drives them crazy when they don't know where you are, what you're doing. They want to know you know, and they couldn't get contact with us. Anyway, I got orders to go to the bridge as fast as possible. Well, the problem was we had come in and left a lot of Germans behind us with our vehicles. So we had a little trouble getting back to getting out to where our vehicles were, but we got out, and it was a miserable day trying to get to that 20 miles. It took us all day. We just had trucks just as they became available, and everybody on the west side was heading to Remagen, and everybody on the east side and the Germans was heading to Remagen. So the roads were clogged, and it was rainy, and of course, over there it doesn't get dark till 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning sometimes, and it's dark again pretty early in the afternoon. But our second battalion went across the bridge about 4:30 that morning and took a couple of towns. And about 10:30, the 1st battalion went across, took a couple of towns. Well, I didn't get to the bridge until about 6:30 or 7 o'clock. Of course, pitch black dark, the darkest night I've ever seen. I met Colonel Smythe at the bridge there, and he gave me an objective of Olenburg, a little town which is about roughly 2 miles south of, west of the, southeast of the bridge. Well, I knew that by then the road went right down the river, the Rhine River, and then up the hills to Olenburg. I knew that by then the road would be, they'd have it defended fairly well, and that it would be suicide to try to go up that road with no reconnaissance in strange territory in the black night and do anything. So we just took up over the mountain there, climbed over it. At the end of the east end of that bridge, the railroad tunnel goes through the mountain there. But we went over the mountain, and it's separated from the high ground where Olenburg is located by a little stream, the K-A-S. We went up on that and across the stream, heading up to Olenburg. Now, my plan was to come into Olenburg from the rear, because I knew they'd have all the front down there fortified. Well, it takes a whole lot of luck. It's one of the skills to find a small town, maybe a dozen houses or so, on a black night, 2 miles away. And as we crossed that stream and started up the high ground to Olenburg, the unexpected always happens. We ran into all these grapevines. Two wires, one about knee high, and one about chest high, with these grapes on them. You had to climb through every one of them. They were about 3 feet apart. And I thought, oh, we'll never get through these before daylight. They'll catch us out here. But K Company was on my right, and the company commander called me on the radio and said, I think we've come to the edge of the town. Oh, that's the best news I'd ever heard. I said, well, shoot a tracer so I can see where you are. They fired a tracer in there, and we were right close to it too and didn't know it. We all moved into the town, and sure enough, most of the Germans were down in front there, had a position down there, but the rest of them were all asleep in the houses there in Olenburg, and we just moved in with them. And it kind of got a little rocky there for a little while when you had Germans and Americans both, in the same house. It wasn't long till we got that cleared up. And soon as we did, then I got orders. We were trying to expand the bridgehead to go to a little crossroad, maybe 500 yards, a little further up, little crossroad of Earl there, and to take that. Well, the next morning we tried it. By that time, the Germans had moved everything in there. The whole 11th Panzer Division had moved in there. I and K companies went up bare breast. They made it to the edge of the town, but it was terrible. It was just, and all those, the German tanks and everything, they were just killing us like flies. And I called Sergeant Thorndike with his tank destroyers. I said, you see all those tanks? Get your tank destroyers around here where we can do something about those tanks. He said, said, we ain't got a chance against those tanks. And he was right. They had a 76 millimeter gun, and the tanks had 88 millimeter guns. They could knock ours out just like that. We could hardly touch theirs. So I said, that don't make a difference. You see those dead soldiers? Get your ass out there right now. And he did. And the first thing he did was, I guess he fired in haste, but his projectile hit right in front of the Tiger tank and ricocheted through the belly. The only way in the world he could have knocked it out. Knocked out, it was written in one of the New York papers where he knocked out this Tiger tank thing. Well, we get calls all the time from division, hold at all costs, Well, we did, but it was a big cost. I think we ended up that day, the biggest company I had was an officer and 16 men. We lost most of the battalion that day, but we were still there. And other troops came across and expanded the bridgehead, and then it was on toward Berlin. So we went on clear to the to Dessau on the Elbe River, which is just 45 miles this side of Berlin. And the last day of the fighting, I got hit again and evacuated. So that ended it up. Now, I've run over time here a little bit, but I'll take any question. And these books that I'm talking about, the things that I've just barely mentioned, will be expanded a lot in these letters. You'll get some things I haven't talked about in those letters. Anybody got any questions before I sit down?
Doris got one.
Yeah, I want you to tell them about your jeep driver. His name was Stinky Miller. And he couldn't wake you up one morning and the convoy left without you.
That's true. Stinky Miller was, he was from Detroit. And after he started driving for me, he told me that he had 28 major traffic violations. He was the best driver. And he had to, although he just had an 8th grade education, any country you were in, whether it was Italy or France or Germany, he was speaking the language like a native in no time, you know, and I couldn't figure how he did it. I'd had about 3 years of Latin, but I couldn't do it. And one day, we were up in this town in Germany, and I said, really, I bet there's a butcher shop in this town. They didn't know we were anywhere close. But there was. And he got 2 little steaks there. They weren't very good, but he got 2 steaks. And they went down the street. There was a big German woman standing in the door of her house, which was right on the street. And I said, let's see if that woman will cook these steaks for us. I heard him. He got out, he went up to the woman, he said, haven't you placed to cooking these steaks? No. She understood it perfectly. And she cooked the steaks, gave us a boiled potato and a little glass of cognac. That's it.
You got some family here, would you mind introducing them?
Yeah, I've got my family here. I've got my wife Doris, daughter Debbie, and Patricia Moore.
Other things to tell about him, but they won't do for mixed company.
She says she loves you. I think. Mr. Tanner, I'm gonna give you this gift here. It's nowhere near what you've done for us, and I also have a pen, a lapel pen that we got this at Pets.